Hey, everybody, it's Dylan Kight checking in for the first podcast that I've done by myself. So I'm not really sure what I'm doing, but I'm glad you're here. What I'm hoping to accomplish is to tell you what I'm up to, what I've been working on. I'm going to have some guests on here, talk about music related things, hopefully things that you find of interest. And if not, it'll be worth laughing at, right? So 2 months ago, I put out a record called Late Bloomer in a Wallflower Suit. And in typical musician fashion, I've done a terrible job promoting it. Now, some of you might say, well, Dylan, I follow you on Instagram. You're doing all right. You post a lot about it. And that's true. I do feel like I posted a lot about it. But it's more than that. I'd like to go a little bit deeper, have longer conversations about some of the songs, about recording, maybe have some of the folks that played on it on here. To me, that's interesting. And hopefully you find that interesting too. So we're not going to unpack every single lyric and what it means and why I wrote it, because that's not super interesting to me, maybe to you. And maybe if you buy me enough Topo Chicos, I will entertain some of those questions. But here, it's really just to talk about, to me, the interesting parts that I want to share. You know, we'll see where it goes. I don't have a title for this. Maybe I should. Maybe that means that I would have put more thought into it. But the idea of having this conversation has existed for a long time. Interestingly enough, I put out a record in 2008 called The Nightbirds Revolt. And when I started working on the follow-up, I actually started to record a podcast back then about the recording of the new song. So I was like, this will be super interesting. I should talk about what I'm working on now. And I think it was called Welcome to Nowhere. And the great thing is those songs never saw the light of the day for the most part. But I do have a couple of those recordings on my Mac that I may or may not share some clips for. Just never made the light of day for whatever reason. But, this idea of having a more open, direct conversation is what I've wanted to do, because this is the kind of stuff I like. I like to listen to podcasts and watch YouTube videos around process, around stories, and digging a little bit deeper. And that's the stuff that interests me. And I hope that's the stuff that maybe is interesting to you. But right now, it's important to talk about Late Bloomer in a Wallflower Suit. It's important to talk about how we got there. And I think it's also important to unpack some of these songs. And each song is going to have a little bit different of angle about what I want to talk about. And again, we're going to figure out a way for people to ask questions if that's a thing. I would like to have some guests on from time to time and keep this kind of free-flowing. But these first couple conversations are going to be really centered around the record and around some stories behind the record that I think are of interest. So going back to the pandemic, I was in a band called Brilliant Mistakes, and we made a record called Outsiders. And that whole record started by accident. It started by us trying to figure out the audio interface, Chris McAvoy and I. And by happenstance, the very first thing we recorded ended up being on the record. And we originally got that recording set up to record it another artist who was involved in like a bike injury, so we weren't able to start when we thought we would. And we just started recording all these songs that we'd done outside of band practices. And Brilliant Mistakes was a project I put a lot of time, effort, and energy into. It was the first band that I had been in since, before I stopped doing music. And we're not going to talk about that on this podcast yet. But we will get into that, because I do think it's interesting, because I think we've all had moments in life where we not question our motivation, but question like, what exactly am I doing here? But that's a story for a different day. Anyway, Brilliant Mistakes. Ton of time, effort, energy. Album happened by happenstance. And Bob Goen is on bass on that record. And Michael Cutter is on lead guitar on that record. And that whole record had so much time and energy put into it. It took us about 6 months-ish on and off again to record and do the overdubs. And when we met Michael in the summer of, 2021 maybe, the record wasn't done. We had actually tried to mix it ourselves. Newsflash, have someone mix your record. Even if it's a friend, it helps, because we definitely went through that where we tried to mix the first go of it. It didn't sound great. There was a lot of guitars. The drums didn't sound awesome. The bass didn't sit right, because we had no idea what we were doing. We had gotten some good sounds, So we went to the next step, like, okay, we're going to have somebody else mix this record. Now, that's a really smart decision, but it only helps if you give really good notes. And we did not give the person that we were working with great notes, even though they had worked on projects I really respected. And there was way too many guitars to choose from, way too many vocals to choose from. And they gave us a first mix of a song called Favorite Secret, and it sounded good. And so we're like, we would like to move forward and do the rest of the project. But based on that song, we didn't provide any additional notes or context. Was, at least in my mind, I was like, okay, no, this sounded great. Let's if the rest could sound like this, I'd be happy. The person doing the mixing also had a planned vacation out of the country, and so there was a deadline. There was one where we were told the record would be done, and there was a follow-up where if we want to get all revisions or any kind of suggestions back to the person mixing the record so it could be done before they went on vacation. They didn't get us any mixes until the day before they went on vacation, which schedules come up or things come up on the schedule. There's priorities that come up. Totally get that. But it put us in a real bind, and we heard the record and we were really disappointed because nothing sounded as good as Favorite Secret did. At that same time, we were looking to round out the sound with a fourth member. And so we found Michael Cutter. And Michael, excellent guitar player, great person. And, when he came to the fold, it was kind of this moment of like, hey, you can still be on these recordings. He was pretty adept at the recording side of things. And so we had him add guitar parts, and it worked great. So we kind of entered this next phase of recording for Outsiders, that Brilliant Mistakes record, which involved re-recording some guitar parts, some background vocals. And then we decided to mix the record as a group because Michael had more experience, but we were all going to kind of have these sessions where we'd all listen in. And the results are uneven. I'm still really proud of that record. I actually have really fond memories of making that record, which I'm happy about. It ended up what it was. It was kind of a hodgepodge, and to me it sounds like that. I promise I'm getting to the point because I told you I wanted to talk about Late Bloomer and Wallflower Suit. But I think what's important to understand is kind of how we arrived at this point. So Outsiders took about a year and a half, I think, or maybe 2 years to really get complete. And we did everything the wrong way. So they tell you to put out if you're going to have a record, put out singles, do a waterfall campaign, quote unquote, trickle the releases. We did none of that. We put out one single that was not connected to anything, and then we put out the record. And because we, as a group, had put so much time, effort, energy into completing this record, we thought it would be great to put out the record on New Year's Day. That's right. New Year's Day, the day that everybody wants to go onto social media or their favorite music app and listen to a band they've never heard of. So needless to say, don't put out a record on a holiday, even if it's a Christmas record. Don't do it. It's not advisable. But all that effort and time putting out Outsiders, I have been writing and thinking about the next record because, again, we went to mix this record 3 times. So we put out the record, played some shows behind it. There was a lot of momentum. And so since a lot of that, from a result standpoint, was successful, we thought we're going to do pretty much what we did on Outsiders, and we're going to make some small changes. We want the drums to sound a certain way, for example. Insert whatever changes we were looking to make. Now, the issue when we went to make the second record is we had the expectations that it was going to sound better than the first record. And that's tough. So again, we had improper expectations, and everybody really wanted it to be great. And, bands are fickle things. Some bands last a really long time, and it's great. And sometimes bands last a couple months, and it's a couple months too long. And we really should have taken a break before we made that second record. There was a lot of things going on in all of our lives that was causing stress and our universe that we were kind of bringing into recording sessions. And so we had all these songs that we had been playing. And of course, like every band, we were super excited about the new songs. And we went to record a couple of the songs, and the vibe was off. my people. And when I say the vibe was off, I mean it was all the way off. And as a band leader, I didn't slow that down. And I was inside of my own head. I was thinking about it from my perspective. And if I had it all over to do again, I would have taken a break. I would have told everybody to go hang out with their family, go be people for a couple months, and we'll see each other at a later point. Let's just take a breather. I didn't do that. Instead, because at that point we were recording several days a week, it was to send everybody in the group thread a new version of the mix as soon as I finished it. And I'm sure that burned people out. I know it did. But we got a couple songs into it, and it became apparent that we were hitting that ceiling of our ability and what we were getting, and it wasn't hitting our expectations. And everybody believed in the songs, but bands, kind of like relationships, aren't linear. Everyone still had very specific opinions on how we should record, where we should record, and there was a real split of opinion. And I was not a great band leader of this band. Not that there's just things I would do over again because I have the experience now as an adult of going through those things. I went through that process myself as a younger person. Oh, well, no worries. We'll just keep working hard and we'll get through this. Because, in life, if you just keep going, you're going to probably get to where you need to be, or you're going to get further along. Needless to say, Brilliant Mistakes started to split at the seams, and we tried in a million different incarnations, and it became very clear that we had reached an impasse. So at this point, I had all these songs, and Michael and I believed that these songs should be recorded in a certain kind of way. And we were just of the same mind at this time. It wasn't that the other two guys in the band were wrong. Like I said, we should have probably taken a break and things would have ended up much better in the long run. But Michael and I decided to think outside of the box. Like, maybe we should just go to a studio. Maybe we should have, because, guys, part of the issue when you record yourself is you're also the engineer. So you're not only the producer, but from the very beginning of the chain, you are the engineer. You're setting up the microphones. You're doing signal flow. And there's nothing that blocks awesome vibes of a take. Hey, what is that humming sound? Hey, why isn't the bottom snare mic making any signal anymore? And so we're like, we need to hand this to somebody we could trust, right? And so anyway, that really started the beginning of the Late Bloomer and a Wallflower sessions, whether we knew it or not. And that was the spring of 2023. And those were really good sessions. And we recorded 3 songs in 2 days, finished, mixed, tracked, everything was done in 2 days. But we had 3 songs, and they sounded great. And we were like, this is the model. This is how you do it. This is what we need to be doing. Well, needless to say, Brilliant Mistakes fell all the way apart. And Michael and I had no idea how we were going to release these songs. At the same time, I started playing a lot of acoustic shows. And Michael and I live a certain distance away from each other, where it became increasingly harder to make multiple times a week a reality. And I just wanted to get these songs out there. I had moved to Woodstock, and I found just a real supportive community playing music in the Woodstock area. And I remember I'd put up my Brilliant Mistakes sign, and as I played just by myself. And it was, I'm pretty sure, Carrie, who was like, what's that about? And I was like, that's a great question. That's my old band. It's like, oh, that's kind of confusing. And I agreed. It was confusing to be playing these shows with a band that no one had ever heard of. When it came to releasing the music, that's where it really started to change into, what is this going to look like moving forward? And we'll talk about the Nightbirds on a later podcast, because I have a whole thing planned on that. But that's really how we got from Brilliant Mistakes to recording Late Bloomer and a Wallflower Suit. The first song on the record is called Worst of Me. And while it wasn't the first song that I recorded or even wrote for the record, it was the song that I think summed up the way I felt creatively and as a person. For my friends, that band was no longer a thing. And so it was an open letter to friends, me kind of acknowledging that this could be all my fault, for better or for worse. Now, worst of me, whether Michael knows this or not, one of the really great things that he did for me as Brilliant Mistakes was kind of falling apart, he had this one night a week jam that he would host at his house, and they would just play covers. And it was just fun. And it had been a couple years since music was just fun. Not that I didn't have a ton of fun playing in Brilliant Mistakes, but there was no expectations on this jam night. There was no expectations to play out. It was just a couple of people getting together, and somebody would call out a song, and then everybody would just hang on for the ride. And that was liberating in a way, to play, to have fun, as crazy as that sounds. And the lick that started the idea for me is we played a version of Raspberry Beret, but the Hindu Love Gods, which was Warren Zevon and the guys in REM minus Michael Stipe, had put out a record, I think in the late 80s or early 90s, and they covered Raspberry Beret, but they do like this kind of haggard rock, Neil Young kind of version of this great Prince song. And they echo the string part in one of the verses, da 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 da. And that's how Worst of Me started, because we were playing that, and it just got stuck in my head. That version of Raspberry Beret, which, by the way, let's say, Prince is amazing. There's nothing wrong with the original. But as you can imagine, I'm not Prince, and neither were the guys that we were hanging out with. So the Hindu Love Gods version was a lot more obtainable. But the original voice memo of Worst of Me that I recorded on my iPhone, it has that part on it to start. Da 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 da. I've heard love songs and they didn't mean nothing to me. Da 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 da. That was it. Now, the interesting part about, for me, the process is that typically songs come in like one or two ways, but they usually come pretty fast. And there's not a ton of edits. And that's something I've tried to get better as a songwriter, is my editing skills, and be a lot more ruthless, whether it's words or sections, but really just try to be a better editor, because the ideas aren't the problem that I have. But, Worst of Me, it's almost in the same form that original iPhone demo is, except I didn't really have a chorus. I just had these verses, and I had this bridge that didn't make the record. And so it kind of existed in this iPhone, and I'd bring it to some rehearsals and play with some different people, and I'd bring the song, and it never sounded the way in my head that it sounded in a room. I wrote the chorus. I didn't actually finish the song until about a month before the final session for Late Bloomer. And the record would have been totally different had it not been for that last session. In the last session of tracking, we did Worst of Me, High and Lonesome, Long Way Around, and Dark Water. I mean, that's really the identity of the record, in my opinion, were those last four songs that I recorded. But Worst of Me, when I wrote that chorus, I was like, wow, now this thing makes sense. And I hope that if someone finds my music that, it's ambiguous enough where you can draw whatever conclusions you'd like to draw, and that your truth can kind of live inside of that world. But Worst of Me is really a song about friendship, and it's a song about that journey, about the highs and the lows of that experience. And it may seem like a love song, and maybe it is. Worst of Me was kind of a letter to myself about that transition, about that process, leaving mistakes into the Dylan Kight record, Late Bloomer in a Wallflower Suit. Without that song, I'm not sure that it's the same record. There's a certain amount of awareness that is in Worst of Me that isn't in the other songs, but there's almost like a present tense that is anti-nostalgia, towards the end of the song. It's saying that when you look back, something can be so perfect it's rotten. And it's not looking ahead either. And so it's one of the few songs that's really kind of in the moment. And that's how Worst of Me came to be. Now, how it made it on the record. So I had this iPhone demo, been working on how do I finalize this? Why doesn't it sound like the way it does in my head? I write the chorus. It's now this kind of big song, but I still have the fucking Prince thing. I still have Raspberry Beret, the part. And so, the intro on the album and the outro, the reason why that's even a thing, and because that's not really on any of the other songs, is I just always heard it with a part to begin in the song. And so I figured out a way to not have a Prince ripoff on my record. His lawyers are a lot better than my non-existent lawyers. But, that's kind of how that song came to be, and that's what that song meant. And that's why it was so important to start the record with that, because symbolically, coming from Brilliant Mistakes, that's a real touchstone in this collection of songs. And the last verse, it says it better than I probably could have in the, however long this is going to be. Bands break up, but your favorite songs never get forgotten. That line was exactly how I felt, and there's a lot of lines about friendship in there. And yeah, those songs still matter. We still play some of those songs live now, the Brilliant Mistakes songs. But that's worse to me. And I've had the great fortune of playing that song out, and it gets a good reaction. Even Greg Shaddix, Mr. Greg Shaddix, local legend, icon of the camera, of the stage, and the microphone. He said he'd love to cover that song. And that's a real honor when another songwriter tells you that they like a song so much that they want to play it or they do cover it. That's like the highest form of praise that you can get. And I'm sure if he does do that, it'll be better than the original. So stay tuned. And that's how that came to be. So that's a little bit of how my journey evolved from being in the band before that and then into the solo record. And now the record's out. And so you can hear the whole thing, the whole kit and caboodle. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak about this kind of stuff to you guys. And I hope this stuff's interesting to you. I've started and stopped this idea probably 30 or 40 times in the last couple years alone. And it might become something completely different in a couple months. But I appreciate your time. I appreciate the ability to have this candid conversation just between you and I. And those are some of my favorite conversations, is about music, how things came to be. And I hope you found some of this interesting. There are going to be other episodes that I'm releasing. So if you find this interesting, I hope that you subscribe. I hope that you tell a friend, because that sort of thing matters. Whether it's putting out music or putting out a podcast, that's really the best way, is when someone that you know, someone that you trust, you care about, says, hey, this is awesome. You should check that out. And that is the best way to get the word out. Friends, until next time.